April 12th, 1943. The early morning sun stretched thin over the rolling countryside of northern France. At 27,000 feet, the chill of the high-altitude winds seeped into the cockpits of a formation of Messerschmitt Bf-10-9s. Oberleutnant Hans Priller of JG-26 squinted through his plexiglass canopy, scanning the horizon for the usual silhouettes of Spitfires or the occasional P-40. Instead, a cluster of unfamiliar aircraft caught his eye, their bulky forms punctuating the clear blue sky like armoured whales gliding over the patchwork fields below. "Was ist das?" Priller muttered, a mix of curiosity and amusement in his voice. He nudged his wingman, Lieutenant Karl Richter, who laughed softly. "Looks like the Americans have sent us pregnant cows," Richter said, a dry smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Schwerer Brocken. That thing won't even turn." The Americans called it the Thunderbolt, though Luftwaffe intelligence had only heard whispers of the new jug from intercepted communications. The sight confirmed it. These were no Spitfires, no P-40s. These were monstrous aluminum behemoths, their broad fuselages and oversized radial engines giving them the appearance of slow-moving, heavily fortified cargo planes. But there was something in the symmetry, the design of the aircraft, that hinted at more than just brute mass. Major Donald Blley, leading the 56th Fighter Group, felt the familiar thrill of first contact. His squadron's P-47Ds, straight from the Lockheed production lines in Chicago, had been meticulously checked the night before. Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engines purred with restrained power, turbo-superchargers humming beneath the cowling, capable of sustaining combat at altitudes where most fighters were gasping for breath. 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns lined the wings, each loaded with enough ammunition to obliterate the flimsiest of Luftwaffe fighters in seconds. Blley's mind raced as he considered the perception the German pilots would have of them. Slow, ungainly, overbuilt. A target, yes, but one that could take punishment and still return home. From the German perspective, it was almost comical. The 109s danced around the Thunderbolts, their lighter frames nimble, their engines singing in response to every tilt of the stick. "They're fat," Priller remarked, gesturing at a P-47 that lumbered into formation with a confidence that seemed absurd. "All that metal, all that weight. How can they turn with that belly?" The first passes confirmed what the Luftwaffe had expected. In a turning fight, the P-47s lagged. They banked reluctantly, their mass dragging them in wide arcs that any competent Bf-109 pilot could exploit. But Blley and his men had learned quickly. They were not here to engage in dogfights. Their orders were simple: maintain altitude advantage, use energy and speed, and trust the machine that carried them. They called it boom and zoom, a tactic that allowed them to strike, climb, and strike again, avoiding the slow-turning traps the Germans had anticipated. Even in that first encounter, the human element was undeniable. Blley watched as Lieutenant Robert Johnson, the youngest pilot in the group, handled his aircraft with a mix of nervousness and precision. Johnson had trained for years on lighter fighters, but here, in the steel-backed P-47, he discovered a strange confidence. The aircraft was not elegant, it was a fortress. When German rounds nicked the fuselage, the vibrations shook the cockpit, but the plane held. Johnson felt it beneath him, the reassuring thrum of the engine, the solid resistance of the aluminum frame, the weight that paradoxically gave him freedom in the sky. Priller and his squadron noticed it too, though they would not admit it aloud. The Thunderbolt's size suggested vulnerability, yet each pass it made seemed to leave its wings and fuselage intact, its speed momentarily surprising them as it dived past in a streak of silver and blue. "Idiots," one pilot muttered, watching a P-47 swing back into formation after absorbing a volley of 20mm cannon fire. "They fly like tanks." The Germans began tallying the possibilities in their minds. If a fighter could carry that engine, that armour, and that firepower, How many could the Americans build? How many men trained? How many airfields supported? How much industrial capacity behind this one aircraft? They laughed, but behind the laughter was unease. Mockery had been instinctive, almost reflexive, but now it hesitated under the weight of logic and observation. Back in the 56th Fighter Group, Blley adjusted his oxygen mask and studied the map spread across his cockpit floor. The route over northern France was perilous, yet the P-47s carried enough fuel, endurance, and turbocharged engines to handle the altitude and range required for deep penetration missions. It was not just the design that impressed him, it was the philosophy behind it. These aircraft were built to endure, to return, to dominate not through elegance, but through industrial logic and overwhelming capability. As the sun climbed higher, the encounter drew to a close. The German pilots peeled away, still shaking their heads, still muttering about the jug, but with an unspoken understanding. These would not be the easy victories they had expected. Major Blley's squadron returned to base with minor damage, some bullet holes through wing panels, but every pilot alive, every engine intact. It was a quiet triumph, the kind only a pilot can understand. The satisfaction of a first engagement where preparation, understanding of the machine, and calculated tactics outweighed size and reputation. That morning, as the P-47s taxied to dispersal, mechanics busy inspecting every inch, every panel, Major Blley allowed himself a brief smile. The Germans might laugh at them, call them fat, call them slow, but the real fight had only begun. And when it came, the Thunderbolt would not simply survive, it would redefine the sky. Even in those first moments, hints of the larger story were clear. The industrial might behind each fuselage, the relentless American training, the calculated use of firepower, all foreshadowed a campaign in which sheer numbers, combined with structural resilience and tactical innovation, would begin to erode the Luftwaffe's confidence. The jug was no longer just a curiosity. It was a herald of change, a symbol of what could happen when engineering met strategy, when preparation met daring, and when human resolve met metal built to endure. By the time April drew to a close, the first reports of the P-47's capabilities had reached German intelligence. Dismissed initially as exaggeration, these accounts began to form a pattern. The Thunderbolt was not simply a fighter. It was a machine designed to survive, to strike hard, and to outlast the nimble but fragile Bf-109s. And for the pilots who first laughed at its bulk, the shadow of its presence in the skies above France would linger uncomfortably for the months to come. The first days of May 1943 brought rain and mist over northern France, a thin grey curtain that blurred the lines between earth and sky. The P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group, still fresh from their initial encounters, were tasked with deeper reconnaissance missions and fighter sweeps across the occupied territories. Major Donald Blley had gathered his pilots in the briefing room, maps spread across the table, ink marking enemy airfields and known Luftwaffe patrol zones. The mission was simple: locate, engage, and return. But simplicity in briefing rarely translated to simplicity in combat. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, still grappling with the first taste of real air combat, fidgeted with his flight gloves. The memory of the first encounter, Bf-109S slicing past his wing, laughing at the bulk of his aircraft, was vivid, but now tempered with determination. "We fly to fight, to survive, and to learn," Blley said, voice steady, eyes scanning each young face. "Every sortie teaches us something new about this plane, about our tactics, and about our enemy." By the afternoon, the Thunderbolts roared into the skies, turbochargers humming like distant artillery. Flying in tight formations, they climbed through the clouds, reaching altitudes that often left German reconnaissance puzzled. Oberleutnant Hans Priller, now a few weeks removed from that first sighting, spotted the familiar silver fuselages against the sunlit sky. "Again," he muttered to his wingman, a note of irritation creeping into his tone. They're still there. Still alive. The first engagement began over the rolling fields near Rouen. A flight of 6 P-47s, led by Blley, spotted a small patrol of FW-190s below. The Germans, confident in their maneuverability, dove for the Thunderbolts, expecting the slow, bulky aircraft to falter. But Blley's squadron had learned. Each P-47 pilot clung to energy tactics, trading altitude for speed, diving in and out with precision. The weight that had once seemed cumbersome now became an advantage. The radial engines roared in sympathetic harmony, turbochargers kicking in as the aircraft sliced through clouds with surprising acceleration. Lieutenant Johnson squeezed the trigger of his 8.50 caliber Brownings, the barrels erupting in synchronized fury. Tracer rounds arced through the sky, striking the nearest FW-190. Flames licked the fuselage, smoke curling from the engine cowling. One enemy aircraft spiraled downward, and for a moment Johnson felt a mixture of exhilaration and disbelief. "It works," he whispered into his microphone. "It actually works." Major Blley noted the contrast between the Thunderbolt's performance and German expectations. The Luftwaffe pilots had underestimated the combination of firepower, durability, and pilot skill. Where once they had mocked the Jug as an ungainly, slow-moving target, they now hesitated mid-engagement, unsure how to exploit weaknesses that seemed not to exist. The 8 machine guns, each loaded with armor-piercing rounds, could shred wings, fuselages, and pilots' confidence in a matter of seconds. The human dimension of these battles was as significant as the mechanical one. Lieutenant Samuel Reynolds, a former crop duster pilot turned fighter ace, felt the P-47's stability in the thick of combat. Enemy bullets peppered the fuselage, denting metal, rattling the cockpit, but the aircraft remained airborne, a testament to the engineering that had gone into every rivet and panel. "This plane doesn't die," he said over the radio to his wingman, "and neither will we." For the Germans, the early combat lessons were sobering. Priller watched as his wingman, Otto Becker, attempted a standard vertical maneuver to gain a firing angle. The P-47, surprisingly responsive in a dive, accelerated past them, guns blazing. Becker broke off, shaking his head. "They aren't just fat targets," he admitted quietly. "They fight back. And they survive." The psychological impact of these encounters began to seep through the Luftwaffe ranks. The pilots had trained to exploit speed and maneuverability, but the Thunderbolt refused to adhere to expectations. Even as victories were recorded, losses were minor but instructive. A P-47 nicked by cannon fire forced one pilot, Lieutenant Carl Matthews, to return early. The landing was rough, but the aircraft held. Mechanics later reported minor damage, shrapnel dents and scorched panels, but nothing irreparable. The durability that had seemed excessive on the first day of April now proved invaluable in the harsh reality of aerial combat. The Thunderbolt's philosophy of overbuilt to survive had been validated in less than a month of operations. The pilots learned to exploit altitude, diving at precise angles to engage and disengage. They discovered the importance of formation discipline, how wingmen could cover each other's blind spots while maintaining energy advantage. Each sortie added to an evolving doctrine. Boom and zoom was not merely a tactic, but a lifeline. The P-47's size, previously mocked, became a strategic tool. Bomb racks, auxiliary fuel, and the raw weight allowed for longer missions with more firepower than any fighter the Germans expected to encounter. Back at the base, Major Blley and his squadron pored over combat reports, comparing notes, calculating bullet trajectories, and revising engagement strategies. The first months in Europe had taught them humility, patience, and respect for the enemy. But it also taught them the immense value of their aircraft. The Thunderbolt was not merely a tool. It was a companion, a fortress in the sky, a machine capable of changing the calculus of aerial warfare. By the end of May, the Luftwaffe had begun to circulate internal reports mentioning the new American aircraft. The tone had shifted subtly from ridicule to cautious acknowledgement. While the P-47 could not outturn a Bf-109 in a classic dogfight, it could dictate the terms of engagement, punish mistakes with overwhelming firepower, and survive punishment that would cripple lesser aircraft. For every German pilot that dived on a fat target, at least one would reconsider the assumptions made in training manuals, in theory, and in pride. Major Blley, looking out over the airfield as the sun set, thought about the months ahead. The first combat lessons had been learned at altitude, in brief moments of clarity and terror. Each pilot had grown, each aircraft had proven itself, and the doctrine of energy combat, once an abstract idea in textbooks, was now etched into muscle memory. The P-47 was no longer just the Jug. It was a symbol of endurance, ingenuity, and the American approach to war, relentless, practical, and unyielding. As night fell, the pilots of the 56th returned to their bunks, tired but alive. Somewhere over northern France, German pilots discussed the strange, resilient fighters they had encountered. Laughter remained, but it was softer now, tinged with uncertainty. The first real combat lessons had been learned, and both sides recognized that the skies over Europe were shifting in ways no one could have predicted. June arrived over northern France with a clarity that the pilots of the 56th Fighter Group had come to dread and welcome in equal measure. The sky was open and bright, perfect for reconnaissance, perfect for dogfights, and perfect for testing the limits of the newly deployed P-47 Thunderbolt. Major Donald Blley surveyed the airfield at Liston, where rows of silver-finned fighters gleamed in the sunlight. Engine mechanics moved with practiced efficiency, inspecting propellers, checking oil lines, and tightening every accessible bolt. The Thunderbolts were machines of precision, but even precision demanded human vigilance. Briefing for the day's mission emphasized intelligence gathered from both air reconnaissance and prisoner interrogations. The Luftwaffe had begun deploying more cautious patrols in areas of prior P-47 engagement, and reports indicated a shift in tactics. German pilots were avoiding low-level dogfights, instead attempting to bait the Americans into vertical maneuvers where the lighter Bf-109s excelled. The lesson was clear. The enemy was learning, and the Americans needed to adapt. Blley gathered his flight leaders. "We've seen what they think of our aircraft," he said, pointing to the map with a steady hand. "They still call it a Jug, but every sortie changes that perception. Today we refine our tactics. Energy advantage is our key. Altitude, dive, climb. Remember the boom and zoom. Hit hard, climb fast, and don't linger." Lieutenant Robert Johnson's eyes traced the flight path marked on the map. It was elegant in its simplicity. Climb above, dive with guns blazing, and then climb again, forcing the enemy to chase. "They expect us to dogfight at their level," Johnson muttered. "Let's give them a lesson in altitude." The Thunderbolts took off in tight formations, engines vibrating like an orchestra tuned to the key of war. Blley led the first wave, the 3,500 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines straining as turbo-superchargers whined in synchronized harmony. Flying at 28,000 feet, the squadron carved through scattered clouds, their silver fuselages catching sunlight as German patrols appeared below, small and distant. Oberleutnant Hans Priller squinted, seeing the familiar silhouettes above him. "They climb faster than before," he muttered to his wingman, concern edging into his normally confident tone. The first engagement began near the Loire River. A flight of 8 P-47s encountered a squadron of 12 Bf-109s patrolling at lower altitudes. The Germans, confident in their superior turning ability, tried to lure the Americans into a horizontal dogfight. Blley, anticipating the maneuver, signalled a dive. The Thunderbolts dropped, engines roaring, gravity accelerating them past the Bf-109s. Johnson, gripping his control stick, felt the P-47 respond with unexpected agility for its size. The boom and zoom tactic unfolded with deadly efficiency. Tracer rounds arced through the sky, cutting wings and fuselages, striking engines and pilot compartments. One Bf-109 spiraled downward, smoke trailing like a dark ribbon across the blue. Another attempted to break the dive, but the P-47's acceleration was relentless. In less than 3 minutes, 2 enemy aircraft were destroyed, and the remaining pilots broke off, reassessing their tactics mid-flight. Above, Blley noted the significance of altitude as both weapon and shield. "The higher you climb," he radioed, "the more options you have. The higher we go, the more they are forced to chase and make mistakes." Lieutenant Samuel Reynolds, flying wingman, nodded. The Thunderbolt's weight, once derided as a hindrance, now functioned as stored kinetic energy, allowing dives with devastating speed that Bf-10-9s could not match without risk. The human element remained central. Johnson felt a mixture of adrenaline and clarity as he tracked a fleeing enemy aircraft. "This is what it's meant for," he thought, "not turning with them, but dominating the vertical game." He squeezed the trigger, the 8.50 caliber Brownings blazing, shredding the rudder and wingtips of the pursuing 109. Another P-47 dove in from above, completing the attack and forcing the survivor to retreat. Lessons from these encounters were immediate. The Thunderbolt pilots realized that patience, discipline, and the careful management of energy were far more valuable than mere maneuverability. The Jug was no longer a cumbersome novelty. It was a predator designed to dictate the terms of engagement. Each sortie refined not only tactics but confidence. The Americans were no longer reacting to the Luftwaffe. They were controlling the battle. On the German side, the impact was psychological as much as tactical. Priller, having witnessed multiple failed intercepts, scribbled notes furiously. "These aircraft are heavier but faster in the dive and harder to damage than expected," he wrote. "Our traditional dogfighting rules do not apply." The Luftwaffe was forced into a reluctant respect. Laughter at the Jug persisted in mess halls, but the tone had shifted. Ridicule had given way to caution, and caution often preceded desperation in air combat. Back at Leiston, Major Blley and his officers debriefed pilots with meticulous attention to detail. Each engagement was dissected. Approach angles, dive speeds, engagement distances, enemy maneuvers. Charts were drawn, calculations made, and the evolving doctrine of P-47 operations took shape. Pilots shared notes on energy conservation, dive angles, and the optimal use of firepower. Mechanics detailed the stress tolerances of the aircraft, reinforcing the confidence of pilots who now trusted their machines implicitly. The month closed with a series of strikes against German airfields near Caen. Thunderbolts, fully loaded with bombs and fuel, engaged in long-range escort missions, suppressing enemy fighters while demonstrating the industrial capacity of the United States. The P-47's ability to absorb damage, return fire, and continue missions impressed not only American command, but also the emerging consensus among German intelligence. The Jug was a new standard in aerial warfare, a disruptor of previous doctrines, and a machine to be reckoned with. By the end of June, the 56th Fighter Group had recorded 15 confirmed kills with minimal losses. The airmen had learned to integrate raw firepower with tactical discipline, turning the P-47 into a weapon that extended beyond simple aircraft capability. It became a symbol of American ingenuity and resilience in the sky. Major Blley, reflecting on the month, noted quietly to his adjutant, "We have taught them to respect what they once mocked." And that respect, more than anything, changes the air above France. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the airfield, pilots prepared for rest. Engines cooled, but minds remained alight with calculations, tactics, and the memory of the day's engagements. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once the butt of jokes and ridicule, had proven itself. And as the Germans adjusted their doctrines, the Americans refined theirs, proof that innovation, discipline, and sheer firepower could turn the tide, one engagement at a time. July in northern France arrived sweltering and still, a stark contrast to the chaos soon to erupt in the skies. Intelligence reports indicated an uptick in Luftwaffe activity near the Seine and Cherbourg, suggesting that the Germans were still testing their assumptions about the new American jug Major Donald Blley briefed the 56th Fighter Group with a quiet intensity. "Enemy patrols are probing, but predictable," he said, tapping a map dotted with red ink. "They still underestimate altitude and acceleration. Today we capitalize on that. Stick to vertical maneuvers. Control the fight, don't chase it." The P-47s rolled off the runway, engines rumbling like distant thunder. Flying in tight formations, the squadron climbed to 27,000 feet, weaving through scattered cumulus clouds. Below them, a group of Messerschmitt Bf-109s patrolled at mid-altitude, visibly smaller, lighter, and seemingly confident. Oberleutnant Hans Priller noted the ascent of the bulky American fighters with a mixture of disbelief and unease. The engagement began as the Thunderbolts executed their standard boom and zoom. Diving from above, they struck with precision, strafing engine nacelles and fuselages. One Bf-109 spiraled violently as 8.50 caliber rounds tore through its wing, smoke streaming behind it. Another attempted a counterdive, only to be met with a second Thunderbolt's carefully timed dive. Lieutenant Robert Johnson radioed mid-engagement. "Energy advantage maintained. They're trying to lure us into a horizontal fight, but we keep the high ground. Keep it tight." The Luftwaffe pilots, now learning the hard lesson of underestimating the P-47, began adopting more defensive maneuvers, breaking formation and attempting evasive rolls. Yet the Thunderbolt's combination of speed in dives, ruggedness, and concentrated firepower kept them lethal. One German pilot, attempting to outmaneuver a Thunderbolt, underestimated its weight in the dive, resulting in catastrophic structural damage to his aircraft. Back on the ground, mechanics and intelligence officers analyzed the air combat reports with meticulous care. The Thunderbolt's high-speed strikes combined with resilience under fire meant that pilots could attack with confidence and retreat without significant risk. The Bf-10-9s, once considered superior in agility, were now forced into cautious engagements, their tactics evolving under the pressure of a heavier, more powerful adversary. Major Blley observed the outcomes from a vantage point on the airfield. "This is more than just flying," he said to his adjutant. "It's a lesson in controlling the environment." The jug may be large and clumsy at first glance, but it dictates terms of engagement. Casualties on both sides remained minimal for the Americans, though the Luftwaffe suffered the loss of 3 fighters, one returning with severe damage. German pilot morale, once confident and mocking, now displayed an undercurrent of respect tinged with frustration. The bulky Thunderbolt, derided in mess halls and intelligence reports, had earned the moniker Flying Fortress Light, a nod to its durability, firepower, and operational range. By day's end, the 56th Fighter Group had further refined their attack protocols: approach from high altitude, dive with concentrated fire, retreat to regroup, and repeat. These tactics capitalized on the Thunderbolt's engineering advantages: the R2800 engine, turbo-supercharger, and 8.50 caliber Brownings, and allowed pilots to engage multiple enemy aircraft while maintaining survivability. As the sun set over the French countryside, the pilots of the 56th returned to base, engines cooling and faces streaked with sweat and grime. Yet a quiet confidence prevailed. The Thunderbolt, once underestimated, was no longer merely a participant in aerial combat. It had become the arbiter of it. Blley knew that the engagements of July 1943 were only the beginning. The Germans were adapting, but so too were the Americans. And as long as altitude, speed, and firepower were leveraged with discipline, the P-47 would continue to redefine air superiority in Europe. August dawned over northern France with an uneasy heat, the kind that weighed heavily on pilots before a mission. For the 56th Fighter Group, now fully operational with their P-47 Thunderbolts, the coming weeks would test both man and machine in ways previously unimaginable. The American strategy had evolved from cautious engagement to proactive dominance. Intelligence from the Royal Air Force indicated increased Luftwaffe movements over key industrial zones, including Le Havre and Rouen. The Germans were intent on disrupting Allied supply chains and testing the durability of the P-47 under combat conditions. Major Donald Blley reviewed the latest reports, his expression tense but controlled. "Today, we're not just chasing enemy aircraft," he said, pointing to the map with a gloved hand. "We're establishing air superiority over the Seine corridor. Keep formations tight. Altitude advantage is key. And remember, jug means firepower. Use it." The 56th Fighter Group rolled out in the early morning haze, engines thundering in unison. The P-47s, often nicknamed Jug for their bulky fuselage and wide radial engine, now carried full fuel and bombs for the first operational ground attack mission. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engines roared, turbo-superchargers pushing the heavy fighters above 27,000 feet with ease, defying the Germans' expectations of sluggishness. From above, the Messerschmitt Bf-109S and Focke-Wulf Fw-190S appeared almost toy-like in comparison. Oberleutnant Hans Priller, now a seasoned pilot with dozens of missions behind him, recognized the subtle shift in dynamics. The Thunderbolts were heavier, yes, but each pound of steel and ammunition translated into an overwhelming force in dive attacks. The first contact came near Rouen. A flight of 6 Bf-10-9s, attempting to intercept Allied bombers, encountered Blley's squadron diving in precision formation. The Thunderbolt's tactic was simple but effective. High-altitude dive, unleash the 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns with disciplined bursts, then climb back to regain energy. The effect was immediate. Smoke trailed from one German fighter's engine. A second spiraled as defensive maneuvers failed to shake the heavy American aircraft. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, observing the carnage, radioed, "Energy maintained. Multiple contacts down or retreating. Jug works every time." The Luftwaffe pilots, initially confident, now found themselves forced into unconventional maneuvers. The Bf-109s tried horizontal turns, hoping to exploit their agility against the P-47's perceived bulk. But the Thunderbolt's superior dive acceleration allowed American pilots to dictate engagements. One German pilot, attempting a head-on approach, was shredded by concentrated fire, leaving only fragments of fuselage to descend toward the Seine. On the ground, intelligence officers noted the evolving pattern. The P-47's ability to engage multiple targets, sustain hits, and deliver heavy firepower fundamentally shifted the air combat equation. The bulky design, once mocked, was now celebrated as a strategic asset. Major Blley, speaking to his squadron after the sortie, emphasized discipline and observation. "The Luftwaffe will adapt, no doubt," he said, standing beside the lined-up aircraft, their radial engines cooling in the August sun. "But our advantage isn't just firepower, it's understanding the fight. Control altitude, maintain energy, and the Jug gives you options they can't match." The following days intensified. The 56th escorted bomber formations deeper into occupied France, engaging increasingly coordinated Luftwaffe defences. The Thunderbolts proved effective not only in air-to-air combat, but also in ground strafing missions. Factories, rail lines, and supply depots felt the concentrated impact of .50 caliber rounds and high explosive ordnance. Pilots like Lieutenant Johnson noted the psychological effect. "They underestimated us at first," he recounted later. When a P-47 dives, you can see the hesitation in their eyes. That pause is all we need. German pilots, in post-mission reports captured later by Allied intelligence, admitted growing respect for the Thunderbolt's design. One BF-109 ace, who survived multiple encounters, wrote, "The Americans have built a machine that laughs at conventional air combat. We can outmaneuver, but we cannot outlast it in a dive or under sustained fire." By mid-August, operational statistics reflected the shift. The 56th Fighter Group claimed over 20 Luftwaffe aircraft destroyed in engagements around Rouen and Le Havre, with minimal losses. The Luftwaffe's defensive formations began incorporating layered approaches, high cover, and increased reconnaissance to anticipate the Jug's dives. Yet the fundamental challenge remained. The P-47 dictated the terms of combat. As the month drew to a close, Major Blley convened a debriefing for his pilots. The focus was on analysis rather than celebration. "Today, we proved the Jug is more than a nickname," he stated. "It's a tool, a weapon, and a shield. But remember, machines don't win wars. Men, strategy, and discipline do. Learn from each engagement, and the Luftwaffe will continue to underestimate us at their peril." August 1943 closed with a series of sorties that solidified the P-47 Thunderbolt's reputation. Pilots gained confidence, engineers received valuable feedback on the aircraft's performance, and intelligence units compiled reports that would shape Allied tactics in the European theatre. The initial mockery of the Jug had evaporated, replaced by a sober acknowledgement. The P-47 was a formidable adversary, one capable of redefining aerial warfare over France. For the men of the 56th Fighter Group, the sky had become a proving ground, not just for the Thunderbolt's engineering, but for the philosophy behind its deployment. Precision, altitude control, and firepower, when combined with disciplined execution, allowed the underdog aircraft to dominate engagements once thought impossible. The Thunderbolt was no longer merely a fighter. It was a statement of American industrial and tactical ingenuity, a flying fortress in miniature, and an enduring thorn in the side of the Luftwaffe. September dawned grey over southern England, the air thick with anticipation and the lingering scent of aviation fuel. For the 56th Fighter Group, the month brought a new and formidable responsibility: long-range bomber escort missions deep into occupied Europe. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once derided for its bulk, now bore the weight of the Allies' strategic bombing efforts, tasked with keeping fragile B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators safe from the Luftwaffe's relentless attacks. Major Donald Blley reviewed the intelligence reports in the briefing room of RAF Horsham St. Faith. Photographs from reconnaissance flights revealed Luftwaffe concentrations near Amiens and Brussels, indicating that German fighters were anticipating the bomber raids. The challenge for the Thunderbolt pilots was clear: intercept enemy aircraft before they could reach the bombers, maintain formation integrity, and return with minimal losses. "The bombers are our priority," Blley reminded the squadron. "A single B-17 lost is a mission compromised. Remember altitude advantage, stick to your escort positions, and keep your eyes open. The Luftwaffe will test our resolve." The flight of P-47s rolled out in the early morning mist, engines throbbing in synchrony. Fully loaded with drop tanks for extended range, the Thunderbolts climbed steadily to meet the bomber formations at 25,000 feet. The radial engines, each generating over 2,000 horsepower, hummed with reliability as the squadron ascended, turbo-superchargers ensuring optimal performance even at high altitudes. From above, the Luftwaffe appeared almost predictably confident. A flight of FW-19s, known for their speed and agility, attempted to intercept the incoming bombers near Amiens. Oberleutnant Hans Priller, now seasoned but wary, led his squadron in a tight formation. They had studied American aircraft reports and assumed the P-47s would struggle to maintain speed and maneuverability at high altitude. The first engagement was sudden. A flight of 8 FW-19s dived toward the bombers, expecting to scatter the formation with bursts of 20mm cannon fire. But the Thunderbolts responded with disciplined precision. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, positioned on the starboard wing of a B-17, observed the approach. "Energy maintained." "Engaging," he radioed, pulling into a steep dive. The Thunderbolt's mass, once considered a liability, now allowed it to maintain momentum in the descent, closing distances with terrifying efficiency. The 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns roared, tracer streams converging on the attacking FW-190S. Smoke and fire erupted from 2 enemy aircraft, while a third attempted a desperate vertical maneuver, only to be cut down by a calculated burst from Lieutenant George "Red" Carmichael. In minutes, the Luftwaffe's initial assault faltered, leaving the bombers unharmed. The psychological impact on both sides was immediate. German pilots began to recognize a pattern. The P-47's dive speed and heavy armament negated their usual hit-and-run tactics. Oberleutnant Priller, reporting back to his base later, would write in his debriefing, "The Americans have machines that punish hesitation. We can maneuver, but the jugs control engagements with weight and firepower unmatched." Beyond the air-to-air combat, the P-47's extended range demonstrated another critical advantage. Equipped with drop tanks, the Thunderbolts escorted bombers deep into enemy territory, sometimes exceeding 400 miles from the English coast. This capability allowed American bomber formations to strike industrial hubs previously considered too risky, including rail yards and munitions factories in northern France and Belgium. Ground crews at RAF Horsham St. Faith worked feverishly to prepare the next sorties, performing rapid inspections and refueling under tight schedules. Major Blley personally oversaw the maintenance of several Thunderbolts, noting the resilience of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines. Even under repeated stress from high-altitude operations, the radial engines remained dependable, a testament to Lockheed's engineering. The human element of these missions was equally critical. Pilots faced not only enemy fire, but also the psychological strain of long hours over hostile territory. Lieutenant Johnson, writing later in a personal account, described the mental rigour. "You're not just flying a plane, you're a shield for dozens of men inside the bombers. One mistake, one lapse in judgment, and it's over. The jug gives you confidence, but it's your resolve that keeps you alive." September's missions culminated in a large-scale operation over Brussels. Over 50 bombers were dispatched to strike a key Luftwaffe supply depot. The 56th Fighter Group, providing top cover, engaged over 20 FW-19s and BF-19s in an aerial dance of precision and aggression. The Thunderbolt's superior dive speed allowed them to intercept attackers before the bombers came under fire, while disciplined formation flying minimized vulnerability. By mission's end, the 56th had claimed 15 enemy aircraft destroyed and 4 probable, with only minor damage to 2 P-47s. The bomber formations, though rattled, returned intact. Major Blley emphasized the lesson in his debriefing. "The jugs are more than fighters, they are force multipliers. Protect the bombers, control the sky, and the Luftwaffe's numerical advantage becomes irrelevant." Post-mission analysis reinforced the P-47's evolving reputation. German records, captured by Allied intelligence, noted increasing difficulty in penetrating bomber defences. The combination of speed, altitude performance, and heavy armament forced the Luftwaffe into defensive tactics, often ceding the initiative to the Americans. By the end of September 1943, the Thunderbolts had firmly established themselves as indispensable components of Allied air strategy. The initial mockery of the jug had transformed into grudging respect, as both pilots and planners recognized the aircraft's versatility and resilience. The lessons learned, discipline in formation, energy management, and aggressive engagement, would shape aerial tactics for the remainder of the European campaign. As the month closed, Major Blley reflected on the squadron's accomplishments. "We've proven that innovation and execution matter more than appearance," he remarked. "The P-47 is not just a plane, it's a declaration. The Luftwaffe underestimated it, and that cost them. We'll continue to make them pay." September ended with the sun dipping behind low clouds over England, the hum of returning engines echoing across the airfield. For the men of the 56th Fighter Group, the P-47 Thunderbolt had proven itself, not only as a fighter capable of outdueling its German counterparts, but as a guardian of Allied strategy, a metal sentinel ensuring that the heavy bombers could deliver destruction without undue loss. The Jug had finally shed the laughter of skeptics, soaring instead on the respect it had earned in fire and smoke above Europe. By October 1943, the European air war had entered a phase of intensity previously unimagined. The Luftwaffe, once dominant over Western Europe, faced an increasingly bold and technologically resilient adversary in the P-47 Thunderbolt. The aircraft that had first elicited laughter from German pilots, mocked as the Jug for its bulk and ungainly appearance, was now rewriting the tactical calculus above the continent. The 56th Fighter Group, stationed at RAF King's Cliff, had accumulated weeks of combat experience. The lessons of high-altitude engagements, dive tactics, and bomber escort were ingrained into every pilot's instincts. Major Donald Blley had become a vocal proponent of aggressive interception strategies, often stressing the advantages of the P-47's energy retention and firepower. For the Americans, the key was to seize the initiative, forcing Luftwaffe units to react to their maneuvers rather than dictate the flow of battle. Early October began with a mission over northern France, targeting industrial facilities along the Seine corridor. Intelligence indicated that elements of Jagdgeschwader 26, JG-26, and Jagdgeschwader 2, JG-2, would attempt interception. The Luftwaffe's seasoned aces, Oberleutnant Hans Priller, Hauptmann Kurt Schön, and Lieutenant Wolfgang Müller, prepared for what they assumed would be another encounter with slow, clumsy Americans. The Thunderbolts, however, had other plans. Flying in tight V-shaped formations at 25,000 feet, the 56th Fighter Group positioned themselves above the incoming Luftwaffe flights. The P-47's R-2800 double Wasp engines, turbo-supercharged for optimal high-altitude performance, roared as the squadron dove toward the German interceptors. In moments, what had seemed like an ungainly mass of metal transformed into a machine of precision lethality. Lieutenant George "Red" Carmichael recounted the engagement in his post-mission notes. "We fell upon them like a storm. The JG-26 pilots didn't anticipate our speed in the dive. They were expecting sluggishness, but the Thunderbolts moved with a confidence that surprised even us. The first contact was brutal and swift. 8 FW-19s attempted to slice through the bomber formation, only to be met with synchronized fire from multiple P-47s. The 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns on each Thunderbolt unleashed tracer streams, cutting arcs of death across the sky. Within minutes, 2 FW-19s were smoking, trailing into the clouds. Another 3 attempted evasive maneuvers, only to be pursued relentlessly by Thunderbolts using boom and zoom tactics, diving attacks designed to exploit their superior speed and mass, while minimizing turn-based engagements where German fighters excelled. Major Blley personally led a flight that intercepted a formation of 12 Bf-109s approaching from the north. The Bf-109, famed for agility and climb rate, attempted to climb above the P-47s to gain positional advantage. But the Thunderbolts maintained energy superiority. Diving from higher altitude, they converted potential energy into kinetic, striking with devastating effect before climbing back to safety. By mission's end, 5 Bf-10-9s had been destroyed and 3 more damaged. No bombers were lost. The psychological shift was evident among Luftwaffe pilots. Post-mission interrogations and captured war diaries noted a recurring refrain. The Americans no longer waited to be attacked. They dictated the fight. Oberleutnant Priller recorded in his log, The jugs, they punish hesitation. A single misstep is fatal. Their guns are accurate, their speed unmatched in the dive. We must rethink every approach. Beyond individual dogfights, October highlighted the P-47's emerging role as a strategic force multiplier. Escorting the newly increased formations of B-17 and B-24s, the Thunderbolts enabled precision strikes deep into German-occupied territory. Rail yards, ammunition depots and aircraft factories that had once been considered too risky for Allied bombers were now accessible. Each successful mission degraded the Luftwaffe's capacity to respond, forcing them into increasingly defensive postures. The operational statistics reflected this shift. According to the USAAF Victory Credits Board, the 56th Fighter Group claimed 42 enemy aircraft destroyed in October, with 19 probables. Losses among P-47 pilots were remarkably low, particularly given the scale and intensity of the sorties. This stark contrast illustrated the effectiveness of both aircraft design and tactical discipline. Human stories from the missions underscored the stakes. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, flying his 42nd mission, recalled narrowly avoiding a fatal collision with a damaged Bf-109. "I saw the spin too late," he wrote later, "but the Thunderbolt's rugged construction absorbed the impact. I landed with only a dented wing and a racing heart. I realized then that this plane wasn't just survivable, it was a lifeline." These accounts became part of the oral history that later informed post-war analyses of the P-47's combat resilience. The Luftwaffe's response evolved throughout the month. Recognizing the P-47's dive speed and heavy armament, German commanders began instructing pilots to avoid vertical engagements and focus on head-on attacks or ambushes at lower altitudes. Yet these adaptations often came too late. American pilots anticipated such tactics, adjusting formation altitudes and escort patterns to maintain superiority. The Thunderbolt's design, initially underestimated, had forced a fundamental re-evaluation of Luftwaffe doctrine. October also highlighted the importance of maintenance and logistics. RAF ground crews, working under increasingly tight schedules, performed rapid engine swaps, airframe repairs, and armament checks to keep the squadron mission ready. The reliability of the Pratt and Whitney engines, combined with rugged airframe design, allowed for rapid turnarounds, sometimes less than 3 hours between sorties, maximizing operational tempo. Major Blley praised the crews during debriefings. "The airmen in the sky can only be as effective as the men on the ground. Their skill is what turns machines into instruments of victory." By month's end, the cumulative effect of Thunderbolt missions was unmistakable. Luftwaffe fighter strength over northern France was noticeably diminished, both in numbers and morale. German war diaries and post-war interrogations documented a grudging respect for the P-47. Hauptmann Schön noted, "They are not elegant, but they are deadly. Every encounter carries risk, and every sortie seems to favor the Jags. We must be cautious." Meanwhile, American pilots were gaining confidence that extended beyond the cockpit. The psychological impact of commanding the skies, combined with the tangible success in bomber protection and enemy attrition, reinforced a culture of disciplined aggression. The P-47 was no longer merely a newcomer. It had become an instrument through which the Allies exerted sustained aerial dominance. In operational planning circles, the Thunderbolt's role began to be codified. Tactical manuals emphasized boom and zoom engagement, altitude advantage, and coordinated escort formations. Intelligence officers compiled kill ratios, performance assessments, and mission reports, reinforcing the aircraft's strategic value. Analysts noted that the Thunderbolt's presence enabled not only bomber survival, but also the attrition of Luftwaffe capabilities, accelerating the broader air war in the European theatre. The month closed with a clear acknowledgement. The P-47 Thunderbolt had shed the derision it faced at first sight. No longer the clumsy jug, It had become a symbol of Allied ingenuity, endurance, and tactical innovation. German pilots approached engagements with caution, Allied planners leveraged its strengths for long-range missions, and the men flying it, battle-hardened, confident, and increasingly experienced, recognized that their aircraft was more than a machine. It was a decisive instrument of war. Major Blley's final memo to the squadron captured the sentiment succinctly. October has shown what discipline, courage, and the right tools can achieve. The P-47 is not just a fighter, it is a statement of intent. The Luftwaffe has learned to respect it. We will continue to press that advantage, and we will not falter. As twilight fell over RAF King's Cliff, engines idling and wings glinting in the dying light, the Thunderbolts stood ready for the next day. October 1943 had cemented their reputation, and the Allies had found in them not only a weapon, but a herald of dominance in the skies over Europe. The Jug had become legend. November 1943 brought a new intensity to the air war over Europe. The 56th Fighter Group, now seasoned from months of combat, was tasked with increasingly ambitious missions, long-range bomber escorts deep into the heart of German-occupied territory. These operations tested both pilots and aircraft to their limits, yet the P-47 Thunderbolt continued to prove itself as a decisive factor in the Allied air campaign. The Luftwaffe, aware of its declining control of the skies, intensified defensive measures. Jagdgeschwader 26 and Jagdgeschwader 2 were redeployed to protect critical industrial centres, including the Ruhr Valley and the Saar region. Despite their tactical skill, German pilots faced the compounded challenge of encountering well-coordinated, heavily armed Thunderbolt formations. Major Donald Blley led a 12-aircraft mission escorting a squadron of B-17s targeting a synthetic oil plant near Cologne. At 24,000 feet, the first German interceptors appeared, a flight of FW-19s ascending from the north. Initially, the Luftwaffe pilots sought to exploit their agility, attempting high-speed slashing attacks against the bombers. But the P-47s, employing boom and zoom tactics, transformed the encounter into a textbook display of energy warfare. Lieutenant George Carmichael described the engagement in his mission report. They came in fast, banking hard to hit the bombers, but we stayed high. Dive, fire, climb. Over and over, until their formation was broken. The B-17s never lost a single aircraft. The 8.50 caliber machine guns of each Thunderbolt raked the German planes, forcing evasive maneuvers that fragmented the enemy's attack. Within minutes, 2 FW-190s were trailing smoke, and another was seen diving out of control. This day marked not only tactical success, but also a psychological shift. German pilots began documenting the P-47's surprising advantages. Hauptmann Kurt Schön noted in his war diary, "The Americans' jugs are no longer a curiosity. They are lethal. Their dives are rapid, their firepower overwhelming. A frontal attack is suicide. Even ambushes carry risk." The Thunderbolt's performance in November also highlighted its resilience. During one escort mission, Lieutenant Robert Johnson was struck by enemy fire in the engine cowling. The R2800 double Wasp engine continued to run, and Johnson managed to bring his aircraft back to King's Cliff with only minor airframe damage. Accounts like this became widespread among pilots, reinforcing the P-47's reputation for survivability. On the ground, maintenance crews worked tirelessly to keep aircraft ready. Rapid engine swaps, ammunition reloading, and airframe inspections were conducted with precision under tight schedules. Ground officer reports emphasized that the Thunderbolt's rugged construction allowed for quick turnaround times, a critical factor in sustaining operational tempo across consecutive missions. By mid-November, the cumulative effect of P-47 operations was becoming evident. Allied bomber missions were increasingly successful, and Luftwaffe losses were mounting. Captured war diaries and post-war interrogations of German pilots consistently referenced the Thunderbolt's impact. Lieutenant Wolfgang Müller reflected, "We have to adjust our strategy entirely. The jugs dictate the fight now. Our aces cannot ignore them. Every encounter carries greater risk than before." The P-47's contribution went beyond individual dogfights. By enabling bombers to strike previously protected targets, it accelerated the degradation of German industrial capacity. Factories, rail yards, and oil refineries, critical to the German war machine, were increasingly vulnerable. Strategic planners noted that the Thunderbolt's presence not only protected the bombers, but also contributed directly to attrition of the Luftwaffe itself. In addition to combat effectiveness, the psychological impact on Allied pilots was profound. Confidence soared as they realized that the once mocked Thunderbolt was now an aircraft that could not only survive engagements, but dominate them. Pilots' post-mission reflections emphasized teamwork, discipline, and the combination of firepower and energy tactics as key elements of success. November concluded with statistical affirmation of the Thunderbolt's rising dominance. The 56th Fighter Group claimed 38 enemy aircraft destroyed, with 15 probables, while losing only 3 P-47s to enemy fire. These numbers, corroborated by post-mission reports and Allied intelligence, underscored a broader trend. The Thunderbolt was not simply surviving, it was reshaping air combat over Europe. As dusk fell over RAF King's Cliff, pilots returned to the airfield, engines winding down, wings streaked with battle scars. In debriefings, Major Blley reminded his squadron that their achievements were only the beginning. "We've proven that the Jug can fight and win, but our task continues. Every sortie is an opportunity to protect, to strike, and to ensure that the Luftwaffe feels our presence everywhere." The Thunderbolt had moved from ridicule to respect, from experimental deployment to strategic necessity. November 1943 confirmed that the P-47 was not just an aircraft. It was a symbol of American ingenuity, discipline, and the growing dominance of Allied air power over occupied Europe. The skies above the continent were no longer a theatre of doubt, but a domain where the Thunderbolt ruled. November concluded with statistical affirmation of the Thunderbolt's rising dominance. The 56th Fighter Group claimed 38 enemy aircraft destroyed, with 15 probables, while losing only 3 P-47s to enemy fire. These numbers, corroborated by post-mission reports and Allied intelligence, underscored a broader trend. The Thunderbolt was not simply surviving, it was reshaping air combat over Europe.